Sip&Talkers, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time zone you're in. Welcome back to Sip&Talk.
And hello from me. It is great to be here for what is honestly going to be a pretty high-intensity deep dive today.
I think we need a high-intensity drink for this one. Before we get into all the policy stuff, I want to start where this whole conversation really kicked off for us.
Yeah.
That projection incident at Chongqing University. This was back on August 29th.
Oh, that story. Yeah. I mean, despite them trying frantically to scrub it from their internet, it went global. It's exactly the kind of thing that just shatters that carefully built image of, total stability.
Absolutely. Someone, and we later found out it was a student named Ki Hong, used a seriously powerful projector to splash these huge, really critical slogans onto a university building.
And the slogans were intense.
Oh, yeah. Things like, down with red fascism, overthrow the Communist Party's tyranny. And the one that really got me was, freedom isn't a gift, you must take it back.
And it lasted for 50 minutes. I mean, in a place known for its high-tech, immediate surveillance, 50 minutes it's basically an eternity. It's a real crack in the facade.
It is.
And it proves that the external image of total control, this unchallenged, unified, great power, is just so different from the reality inside.
You're so right. And that gap, that's really the mission for our deep dive today. We've talked on the show before about the China identity dilemma. The strategic thing where 1 minute they claim to be an advanced great power when they want respect, and then the next they say they're the largest developing country when they want, trade benefits.
And the feedback we've gotten, it confirms this isn't just some abstract political puzzle anymore, this dual identity, this ambiguity. It's hitting listeners directly.
How so?
Well, it's impacting manufacturing jobs in the U.S. and Europe. It's shaping the tech standards you use every single day. And it's even hitting, your grocery bill through climate instability.
So we have to really put a fine point on this. That ultra-cheap product you see, whether it's an electric car, a solar panel, whatever, it's not just the result of, regular market competition. It is a strategic output.
Right. It's what happens when you combine a privileged status in the world order with incredibly advanced technology. This is a state-level competitive play.
Exactly. We really need to make it clear that our industries aren't losing to, fair competition. They are losing to massive state subsidies that are, and this is the key, legally justified by exploiting these system loopholes.
Right.
We're calling this the era of unconstrained output.
That's a great term for it.
It means the state is using the developing country identity to get all this flexibility for subsidies in the WTO system. And that lets their advanced power production lines just run full tilt, without worrying about profit or even demand.
Unconstrained output. That phrase just nails the danger perfectly. It's a deliberate strategy that turns a simple, cheap benefit for you, the consumer, into a massive high-risk trap for the entire global economy. And so today, we are unpacking that trap. We're going to look at data freedom, trade, and the political culture, which critics call boasting and never admitting mistakes. That honestly makes this whole thing feel kind of impossible to solve.
Grab your drink, everybody. The title of our discussion today is Shadow Cracks, China's Dual Power Facade. Okay, let's really get into this core contradiction, because China has these two totally distinct stories they tell, and the way they use them is it's a masterclass in strategy. Let's start with the spectacular side, the advanced great power story.
Right. This is the one for building confidence at home and projecting influence abroad.
And this is not just talk. I mean, the evidence is literally built into the ground.
Oh, yeah.
Just think about infrastructure. They have the world's longest high-speed rail network. We're talking over 45,000 kilometers of track.
Wow.
That one number by itself is more than 2/3 of the entire global total.
That's insane.
When you think about the planning, the money, the sheer willpower it takes to build that much modern infrastructure so fast, it's a staggering show of state power.
It's a level of capability that, frankly, developed nations, tied up with regulations and public hearings, they can only dream of matching that speed.
And what about their cities, their skylines? They own the most super tall buildings in the world.
They have flagships like the Shanghai Tower, and I think the number is something like they account for over half of the world's top 100 skyscrapers.
That kind of high-end advanced construction just screams global superpower. There's no other way to put it.
Exactly. And then you look at space and tech, which is where their drive for self-sufficiency really comes through. I mean, huge milestones in 5G, this massive coordinated push into AI, and their space program is, without a doubt, elite.
The changing moon missions, the rockets.
Right, the Long March rockets, and they're one of only 3 countries that can put people into space on their own. So when they look out at the world, this is the image they present. Totally modern, super efficient, and technologically dominant.
That's the image. It's crucial for their leadership of the global south.
Yeah.
But then the hat switches. As soon as they sit down at a negotiating table, say at the WTO or the UN, boom, they switch to the developing country story.
They do, and they insist they're still the largest developing country. And we have to be clear, this claim isn't, pulled out of thin air. It's based on some very real, very uneven economic facts that people in the West often miss when they just look at the huge total GDP number.
Okay, let's get into those facts. How can the same country that's building 45,000 kilometers of super trains still say it's a developing nation?
It all comes down to scale and distribution. So first, you have to look at the per capita data. China's total GDP is number 2 in the world, an absolute behemoth. But when you divide that number by 1.4 billion people, the picture changes a lot.
Okay, give us the hard number.
So for 2022, 2023, China's per capita GDP was around $12,741.
12,000. Okay.
Now, to put that in context for you, that is roughly 1/6 of the average GDP per person in the United States.
1/6. Wow, that is a huge difference.
It's a vast difference. So if you were just to place them on a global spectrum based on that number alone, they would land, firmly on the lower end of middle income status, far, far below what we'd consider a developed high-income country.
So even if Shanghai looks and feels like Manhattan, the sheer number of people means the average piece of the pie is still pretty small compared to, say, an OECD country.
Precisely. And that brings us to the second point, which is maybe even more sensitive: regional inequality.
Right.
The Chinese government constantly points to this huge gap, this chasm between the hyper-modern coastal cities like Shanghai and the inner provinces, places like Gansu.
And we're not talking about a small wealth gap here, are we?
No, not at all. It's a systemic economic fracture. They argue, pretty accurately, that hundreds of millions of people are still in what you'd call relative poverty. And the most staggering statistic they use internally is this: about 600 million people earn less than 1,000 RMB a month.
Wait, say that again, 1,000 RMB a month.
A month, yeah.
What is that in dollars? Like $140.
That's about it, roughly $140 a month. So just think about that. Nearly half their population, a group of people larger than the entire European Union, is living on less than $5 a day.
Okay.
So when you look at those numbers, their claim of still being a developing nation starts to feel, well, it has a certain internal reality to it, even if the state can launch rockets at the same time.
And that's the core of it, right? How do you manage a system where you have world-class science labs next door to people living on $5 a day?
And here is the systemic loophole they've gotten so good at using. There is no single, unified, internationally agreed upon definition of what a developing country even is.
You just raise your hand and say, I am one.
Historically, yeah, especially in places like the WTO, a member can self-declare, and then the burden is on everyone else to prove they aren't, which is, politically messy and legally almost impossible.
Yeah.
So this lack of a clear standard lets them be totally flexible. They can talk about their total power when they want influence, and then they can talk about their per capita weakness when they want economic benefits. They operate perfectly in that institutional gray zone.
Let's talk more about that gray zone, because this is where policy really becomes a strategic weapon. Like you said, this isn't just market competition. This is institutional arbitrage. We need to be super clear about what that means.
Yeah, the word arbitrage usually means, you're profiting from a price difference in two markets. But here, they're profiting from a regulatory difference between two political identities.
I love the analogy we came up with for this. Let's use the billionaire analogy.
Okay, yeah. So imagine a multi-billionaire, the head of a giant high-tech corporation. But when they go to the government, they insist on collecting low-income welfare checks.
Right. Or they apply for small business grants meant for, struggling startups.
And they use that money, which was meant to help the truly vulnerable, to subsidize their massive corporation, which lets them just aggressively undercut all of their competitors who have to play by the normal rules.
That's it. That's exactly what's happening on the world stage. It's not about being poor. It's about being institutionally aggressive.
It's about gaming a system that was designed to promote equality and instead using it to get a huge national advantage.
And the main place this game is played is the World Trade Organization, specifically through something called Special and Differential Treatment, or SDT.
SDT is the golden ticket. It's this whole package of exceptions they give to countries classified as developing. The first perk is pretty simple: lower tariffs on their exports, which obviously helps their goods sell around the world.
Okay, that makes sense for development. But what about the rules? The regulations?
That's where it's really strategic. SDT gives them much longer grace periods to implement new trade agreements. We're talking 4 to 8 years instead of the usual 2 years for developed nations.
So wait, what does that mean in practice?
Okay, so think about it. If the WTO comes out with a new rule that requires, say, stricter environmental controls or higher labor safety standards, China gets an extra half-decade or more before they have to comply.
So while companies in, say, Germany are spending a ton of money right away to upgrade their factories, Chinese producers can just keep on operating under the older, cheaper rules.
It's a massive competitive advantage. But the biggest poke, the one that ties directly into our unconstrained output idea, is the huge flexibility in applying domestic subsidies.
Right. Developed countries have super strict rules about the state giving money to specific industries.
Exactly. That's why everyone gets so upset about Boeing or Airbus getting state funds. But under SDT, all that scrutiny is way looser for developing nations. This means China can legally pump billions of dollars into their strategic industries, EVs, solar, steel, without facing the same kind of legal challenges. They're literally allowed to subsidize their high-tech sectors to a degree that developed nations just can't.
So, if the West is playing by a rule book with all these restrictions, China's playing by a different one that lets them just pour state money wherever they want, legally.
That is the essence of the arbitrage. Now, here's a twist that sounds contradictory but is just as important. The market economy status, or MES, controversy.
Okay.
So, many major trading partners, like the US and the EU, still classify China as a non-market economy.
And what does that mean?
It's basically an official judgment that their domestic prices aren't set by free market supply and demand because the state, with all those subsidies we just talked about, interferes so much.
So what happens when there's a trade dispute? Like if we think they're dumping cheap steel on our market?
This is the main defensive tool the West has. Normally, to prove dumping, you'd compare the export price to the cost of production in China. But because they're non-market, other countries are allowed to just ignore China's distorted internal cost data.
So what do they use instead?
They use what's called surrogate country data. They look at the real production costs for the same product in a market economy at a similar level of development, like, say, Turkey or India.
I see.
And because the state subsidies in China make their costs artificially low, the surrogate country price is almost always higher than the Chinese export price.
Which means it's super easy to prove they're dumping and then slap on high tariffs.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what we're seeing right now with EVs and solar panels.
Exactly. It's the system's way of saying your prices aren't fair, so we have to adjust. What's so wild is that China fights tooth and nail against the non-market label because it leads to tariffs, but at the same time, they benefit massively from the very subsidies that caused them to get that label in the first place.
It's a complete mess for global trade rules. Okay, let's pivot quickly to two other areas where this status is a huge advantage: climate and geopolitics.
On climate, it's pretty stark. Under the Paris Agreement, having developing country status means China faces looser emission reduction targets compared to developed nations.
Even though they're the world's biggest CO2 emitter by, like, a lot.
By a huge margin. They commit to peaking their emissions by a certain date and hitting carbon neutrality by 2060, which is a full decade later than many developed nations are aiming for.
Which gives their industries another 10 years of cheaper, dirtier production.
Yes. They avoid the immediate high costs of a rapid green transition. And on top of that, they can still technically request funding and technology from developed nations through climate finance programs that were designed to help the poorest countries. It's a remarkable situation.
And then there's the political angle. the leadership of the global South.
Right. Keeping that developing country identity is absolutely critical for their geopolitical power. It makes them the natural, undisputed leader of the global South, the BRICS countries, the G77 group, and it positions them as the main alternative to the Western-led world order.
And this allows them to frame things like the Belt and Road Initiative differently, right? It's not foreign aid, it's South-South cooperation.
Exactly. The BRI is all about huge infrastructure projects, but unlike, say, World Bank loans, which are often low interest and transparent, BRI loans are usually commercial with high interest and backed by collateral, like a port or a mine.
Wow.
By using their developing country identity, they attract partners who are tired of all the strings that come attached to Western aid, and that strengthens Beijing's voice and influence everywhere. That identity is the political currency for the whole project.
So we've laid out the whole mechanism, this dual identity, leading to gaming the system. Now let's bring it right home to you, the listener. How does this strategy, this unconstrained output, actually hit your wallet, your job, and even your data? This is where that cheap benefit starts to look like a high-risk trap.
Let's start with the most immediate thing, what people are calling China Shock 2.0.
Right.
The basic problem is something called overcapacity. China uses all that subsidy flexibility we talked about, combines it with its super advanced factories, and just produces way, way more stuff than its own country can possibly buy.
Especially in those key future industries.
Exactly. We're talking about massive surpluses of electric cars, batteries, solar panels, and all sorts of industrial parts.
We saw the first China shock back in the 2000s,
right?
And we lost millions of jobs in things like textiles and furniture. How is this China Shock 2.0 different, or, I guess, more dangerous?
The big difference is the target. The first shock hit low-tech manufacturing. This new one is aimed squarely at the strategic industries of the future, the exact things the U.S. and Europe are desperately trying to build up themselves, like clean tech.
And this unconstrained output means they can flood the market with products at prices that just seem impossible. I mean, I got to admit, when you see a decent-looking EV for 15 grand, that's tempting. That's the cheap benefit.
It is a huge short-term win for the consumer, no doubt, but that low price is the bait. It's a deliberate price distortion designed to just systematically wipe out foreign competitors.
Yeah.
When a local car company, whether it's in Detroit or Germany, has to compete with a car that's been subsidized by an entire nation-state, they just can't. They fold. That's why the EU is freaking out right now and launching all these anti-subsidy investigations.
So in the short run, we get cheap stuff. But the long-term price is the complete collapse of our own ability to make that stuff.
Exactly. And once your native industry is gone, the global supply chain for that product becomes a monopoly controlled by a single state-backed power. And this leads to the ultimate danger for your economic security, the weaponized supply chain.
That sounds super dramatic, but give me a real-world scenario. How does a cheap car part become a weapon?
Okay, think about EV batteries or the special rare earth magnets you need for any high-tech motor. China controls a huge majority of the processing for key materials, like the graphite that's essential for the anode in every single lithium-ion battery.
So if they decided to just stop exporting graphite?
They did exactly that recently with two other critical materials, gallium and germanium. If they were to do it with graphite or rare earth magnets, the entire EV production line outside of China, in the US, Europe, Japan, everywhere, would grind to a halt immediately.
That is actually terrifying. It means entire parts of our economy could become hostages to, political fights.
It's about economic security. It's about national sovereignty. That cheap EV you bought suddenly becomes a very expensive brick in your driveway if you can't get a new battery for it because there's no domestic industry left to make one. The political risk is literally built into the price tag.
And this fight to be an advanced power isn't just about physical stuff. It's moving into the digital world. And that's where it starts to affect our privacy. We're in a technology standards war.
Absolutely. The fight over the technical rules for 5G, for AI, for data, it's critical because whoever writes the standards dictates how data flows and who gets to control it. And this is where the values of the West and China are just completely different.
So what are the basic ideas behind the Chinese model for these tech standards?
It's built on two core principles: data centralized control, and the idea that national security comes before individual privacy, always. The state must be able to access any and all data.
Okay, that makes sense for how things work inside China. But how does that affect someone listening in, say, Seattle?
Because if the hardware you're using a router in your home, the infrastructure for a cloud service you use, if it's built according to those technical standards, Your personal data has an inherent built-in risk of being accessed.
Wow.
Even if the device is physically outside of China, the architecture it's based on is designed from the ground up to make state access easier.
So this is like a subtle export of their political values, but it's disguised as just a technical standard.
That's a perfect way to put it. They are pushing the idea of internet sovereignty, which means the state has absolute control over information, into the technical DNA of global networks. And this is especially powerful in places in the global south where they're building the entire 5G network from scratch.
And what does this mean for the future, especially with AI?
This is maybe the biggest long-term risk. If the AI models of the future are trained mostly on huge data sets that reflect these values, where, certain historical events or sensitive topics are just censored out of the data, then the AI itself might be incapable of giving you unfiltered critical information.
So it could bake censorship right into the code.
It could bake systemic bias and state priorities directly into the AI that's going to power our future. It's a direct threat to your right to access information.
And finally, we have to talk about the ultimate cost that gets pushed onto everyone else, the climate cost.
This is the perfect example of the whole problem.
Right. They are the world's biggest emitter, but they're using their developing nation status to avoid the strictest climate rules.
Their decision to aim for carbon neutrality by 2060 instead of 2050 like the US and EU basically gives their heavy industry another decade to operate without the huge costs of a really fast green transition.
So what does that extra decade of pollution cost the rest of us?
It's a massive transfer of risk. That delay means higher global emissions now, which speeds up global warming. And the effects hit the most vulnerable countries, the hardest low-income nations, small island states. They're literally paying the price for the pollution that fuels this unconstrained output.
So a consumer in the West gets a cheap solar panel, but the cost is paid by people in the Pacific dealing with rising sea levels.
And it comes home to you, the listener, too. We joke about it being an expensive way to get a cheap widget, but it's true. Those externalized climate costs show up as more frequent and more intense extreme weather, the heat waves, the floods, the droughts.
Right.
And those things directly impact your health, the security of your food supply, and, you better believe it, your home and car insurance premiums. The whole system is designed for one country to maximize its own economic advantage by pushing its pollution risk onto the rest of the world's environment.
That definitely makes the cheap benefit look a lot less attractive when your flood insurance bill doubles.
So let's bring this all back to where we started, that protest at Chongqing University. The student, Chi Hong, had to flee the country after he did that, and he chose that specific method, that sort of theatrical public projection, because the normal ways of expressing dissent are just gone. They're too dangerous.
It's like this act of creative desperation, and it just highlights how absolutely essential it is for the system to maintain that perfect facade of strength and control, no matter what's really happening underneath.
And that pressure comes from a political culture that really drives this whole dual identity strategy. Critics have a pretty good summary for it: boasting and never admitting mistakes.
Let's talk about the boasting part. Unlike in a democracy, the government's legitimacy doesn't come from winning elections, so it has to constantly, perpetually prove that its system is better.
That's the core engine right there. They have to constantly demonstrate system superiority and push the story of national rejuvenation. This means they need a nonstop parade of successes: the high-speed rail, the tech breakthroughs, the poverty reduction numbers. If the good news stops, the entire political mandate starts to look shaky.
And that creates a very specific incentive for every official in the country, right?
Oh, absolutely. Officials get promoted and rewarded for reporting good news, not bad news. It's a system that basically encourages exaggeration at every level. A local official fudges the numbers to their provincial boss, who then polishes them up before sending them to the central government.
Because reporting a real problem is career suicide.
It's seen as undermining the grand story of success, and that is a risk nobody wants to take.
Which leads directly to the other side of the coin: the systemic inability to ever admit a mistake.
In a system that's so centralized, admitting a major policy failure, whether it was a flawed COVID policy or a big economic misstep, it's seen as a direct threat to the authority of the leadership. The system has to present itself as infallible.
So even when they're forced to make a change because of outside pressure, they can't just admit it.
Never. They have to frame it as a proactive, strategic move. A great example is when they finally agreed to stop requesting new SDT benefits at the WTO around 2025.
Right.
Now, that was a direct result of years of immense pressure from the U.S. and others who were threatening to rewrite the WTO rules entirely.
But they couldn't just say, okay, you got us.
No way. The official story had to be that this was a voluntary move, a step taken by a responsible major power. It was framed as an act of generosity, not a surrender to pressure.
So they save face.
They save face, they maintain the story of superiority, and this is key. They get to keep their underlying developing country identity status, just in case they need it again later.
This whole dynamic, wanting the prestige of being a responsible leader, but not the accountability, is what critics call selective responsibility.
That is the perfect term for how the rest of the world sees it. They clearly want the power and respect that comes with being a major global player, but they insist on applying that responsibility completely on their own terms.
So break that down for us. Where are they selective?
Okay, on the economic front, you have to say they are a massive contributor. They provide climate aid. They fund huge infrastructure projects with the BRI. Their growth has pulled the whole global economy along for decades. So they check that box.
But on the security and human rights front, it's a very different story.
The behavior changes completely. There you see actions that Western powers see as deeply destabilizing, the constant military pressure around Taiwan, issuing international warrants for political dissidents overseas, and their economic and diplomatic support for regimes in conflict.
And specifically on the war in Ukraine, there was a pretty specific figure about their indirect support for Russia.
Yes. Independent analysis estimates that China has provided over $50 billion worth of dual-use technology to Russia.
What's dual use?
It's things like microchips, machine tools, advanced navigation gear stuff that isn't technically a weapon, but is absolutely essential to keep a modern war effort going. So that $50 billion figure, it shows a huge, if indirect, challenge to global stability.
So the split behavior, helpful in economics, but a challenger in security, it sends a really clear message.
It says that their commitment to the global order is conditional. It comes second to their own core national interests and strategic goals, and that just fundamentally challenges the whole post-World War II idea of what a responsible global leader is supposed to be.
Yeah.
So let's try to tie all of this together. The core tension here is that China is pursuing what you have to call an atypical rise. It's not like the rise of the U.S. or Germany or Japan. It's using the strategic, contradictory, identity-advanced factories with developing country perks to just maximize its own national interests.
It's a genius strategy if you're looking at it from a purely national interest point of view. But like we've been saying, it just completely breaks the international rule book that was supposed to govern everything.
It does. This strategy is a profound challenge to the entire post-World War II system, the WTO, the UN, the Paris Agreement. These institutions were just not built to handle a major economic power that would deliberately and legally live in this developmental gray zone.
And the failure of those institutions to adapt is just making things worse. It's leading to fragmentation.
Precisely. The U.S. and the EU feel like they have no choice but to go around the WTO and use their own unilateral tools, like these aggressive tariffs, because the existing rules just aren't working anymore. They're being systematically exploited.
And that just breeds more mistrust.
It kills cooperation right when we need it most, for things like pandemics or climate change.
So this brings us to the big fundamental question that you, as a listener, have to think about when you see these headlines about trade wars. What should be the real standard for global responsibility?
Is it total economic output, which is the Western view, right? It focuses on a country's total impact on the world, its total pollution, its market size. Or should it be per capita income and internal inequality, which is the Chinese view, focusing on the hundreds of millions of people who are still struggling?
That one distinction, total versus per capita, that is the entire fight over who writes the rules for the 21st century.
And the answer to that question determines who pays the price. So let's leave you with this final stark thought. The core problem for the world, the real structural risk we all face, is this fundamental imbalance. When a state can legally enjoy all the benefits of a developing country while at the same time wielding the world-shaking, state-subsidized power of an advanced great power, the enormous costs in lost jobs, in compromised data, in a destabilized climate are inevitably transferred directly to your daily life.
You end up paying the price for that strategic contradiction. That's a heavy thought to end on, but a necessary one. Thank you for walking us through this. It's an incredibly dense topic.
It was my pleasure. I really hope we were able to give it the depth it needs. And just a reminder to everyone listening, the whole point here is objective analysis. We're trying to understand the systems and strategies at play, not to criticize any one nation or its people. We just want to give you the facts so you can think for yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into China's dual power facade.
And hey, after wrestling with all that, you definitely deserve a break. So don't forget to subscribe to Sip&Talk wherever to get your episodes.
And a big shout out to our great friend Mickey. If you need to de-stress after all this talk of trade wars, check out his YouTube channel, Mickytolife, for some really fun memes and travel vlogs. He is the perfect antidote to a heavy discussion.
A perfect suggestion. We'll see you next time.
Bye for now.